Okay, thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, and I'm joined today as co-host by Elise Giuliano from the Harriman Institute. This is another one of our regular seminar series on what we call our New York City Russia Public Policy series that we've been running now for 5 years jointly between the Jordan Center and the Harriman Institute, with very appreciative of generous funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to allow us to run this seminar. Today's event is on what couldn't unfortunately be a more timely topic, which is the recent developments in the war following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After a period of time where it seemed like we had gotten into what is often called by political science, what is called a war of attrition, where things were sort of slowed down, there's been a great deal of developments over the past 4 to 6 weeks since the end of the summer. There has been both the Ukrainian the noted counteroffensive, the incredible success of this counteroffensive, and then there has been much speculation about Russia's response to that counteroffensive, and we've now seen the partial mobilization in Russia, and then, of course, the events of the last 24 to 72 hours with the recent attack, the recent events that took place in the Kirch Strait, and then the missile attacks of this morning or today in Ukraine. With that in mind, we've gathered together a wide variety of experts to try to help everybody make sense of these recent developments. And I'm going to turn it over to Elise to introduce all of them. I want to note we're going to do very short introductions of all of our panelists. We have 6 panelists here because there's so much to cover and we really wanted to give a wide perspective here. So we're going to do brief introductions of each of our panelists, and there'll be full bios of the panelists that you can find. We'll post both on YouTube and which we will post in the chat for the webinar. Like all webinars, hopefully most people are familiar with this by now, feel free to use the Q&A button that you'll see on your screen. If you're joining us by Zoom, you can use that to leave questions at any time, and we welcome you to leave questions while panelists are speaking. We will start taking questions after all of the panelists are speaking, and although we have a lot of panelists, we are going to try to make sure we reserve some time for Q&A at the end. On YouTube, you can just leave your questions in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Elise Giuliano to introduce our first speaker today.
Thank you, Josh. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming. Our first speaker is Oksana Shevel, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University. She is also the current president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, and she is an associate of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, also at Harvard University. Oksana.
Thank you very much, Elise. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel. I'll start with a few kind of broader points and what I think are maybe current lessons from the conduct of the war over the last several months. Since the start of the Kharkiv offensive, I think we are looking at a new stage of the war where some major things that have changed, perhaps they changed before, but I think are now becoming evident, and some things that have not changed. So I'll speak a little bit about both, and then I'll talk about the possibilities and the pitfalls of the possible compromise negotiated solution that some have been advocating, and wrap up with a few thoughts on possible ways moving forward in the coming months. So with the things that I think have changed in the last several months, especially with the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, I think it is now clear that Ukraine is capable of fighting not only defensive, but also offensive campaign, that Western weapons made a big difference. Ukraine was able to retake a lot of territory. Actually took more territory, I think, in several weeks that Russia captured since April in the Donbass, and this advance continues both in the south and in the east. So I think the takeaway point from this is that Ukraine actually can win militarily on the battlefield, which many did not believe really up until these most recent events. I think another important change that is also, or the realization, if you wish, that is coming out of this last events of the last several weeks to months, is that Russian military is in much sorrier shape than many believed. So this whole kind of mythology of the mighty Russian army I think is now being challenged. This is not to say that Russian army is completely gone. I mean, obviously it is still a powerful force, and we'll have military experts speak about that. But I think the extent of the rot from corruption in the army is becoming clear. And this is not something that can be changed quickly or improved quickly. So despite this mobilization that Putin announced, which again has its own pitfalls of people, some trying to escape and those that do get mobilized, not being outfitted properly, not trained and so forth. So I think this a kind of different maybe perception or different interpretation of the capabilities of Russian and Ukrainian military capabilities is something that the last few months have revealed, right? Now, on the other hand, there are certain things that have not changed, maybe have been reinforced in the last several weeks and months. One, I think, is very important, is Putin's determination to subdue Ukraine and achieve his maximalist goals of vassalizing the country, destroying its independent statehood, apparently no matter the cost. I don't think there has been any change in that. Putin continues to both proclaim and try to pursue this maximalist goals. I'll come back to it in a minute. And also another thing that unfortunately has not changed is the continuation of the massive atrocities and war crimes that the Russian forces commit against Ukrainian population. If you follow the news, you'll see, invariably in all these liberated towns and villages, torture chambers are discovered. So the kind of conduct of the war, the violation of the laws of the war really remains horrendous. And of course, the latest bombing of cities of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure in the rush hour, this warning is yet another continuation of the same method of waging the war. So this brings me to the point about possibilities of compromise and negotiation that many so-called peacemakers, self-styled peacemakers in the West, and not only, have been calling for, apparently with the belief, if we take them as genuinely wanting compromise, that some sort of reasonable compromise, whatever that means exactly, short of respect of international law and international recognized borders, is possible. But I think there is absolutely no indication that Putin wants to compromise on his maximalist goals, as I said, which it is vassalizing Ukraine. He held these fake referendums, formally annexed the territory. Where these referendums were held, he gives absolutely no indication that he will, back off. In fact, the borders now are supposedly to be determined in consultation with the population. So if he can get more territory, he will try to do that. There is no indication whatsoever that he has any intention to withdraw from any of the territories that Russian forces still control. And again, this sort of continuation of the so-called denazification, dismantling of Kyiv regime, and continued narrative how it threatens Russia, I don't think we have seen any change in that. So because of this in Ukraine, and again, it seems to be somewhat perhaps harder to comprehend for people in the West, but for Ukrainians, it's absolutely clear, and I think they're right in thinking that any calls for negotiations and any kind of ceasefire will be used by Putin to get a breather on the battlefield, to bring in more forces, to regroup and to attack. Again, if not immediately, then in some weeks or possibly in months, and all the while hoping that, they can continue to squeeze Ukraine and hope for Western unity to break. So because of this, we've seen Ukrainian officials repeat time and again that there can be no negotiations with Putin. And because it would only freeze the status quo and give him a chance to, continue his attack on Ukraine and try to get more territory, if and when he can do that. And today's terrorist attacks don't seem to change that. If you have followed, statements Ukrainian authorities are making, they're making it very clear that Ukraine will not be intimidated by these terror attacks. Ukrainian society, and again, we'll hear more about societal situation in Ukraine from other speakers, but just in the last 6 hours donated over 100 million hryvnia to the Prytula Foundation for drones. So again, the society also, is of course horrified by this, but not intimidated. So I don't think, again, this is sort of the point that I'll add to the broader discussion if we have about possibility for negotiations, that Ukraine actually can be coerced into this appeasement. So even if there is, motivation, I don't think there is, that the West is really going in this direction. But I think even if the West tried to coerce Ukraine into some sort of appeasement, I think we should learn by now that Ukraine has agency, that this is not some sort of pawn that can be manipulated. This is the mistake that Putin has made to his detriment. So I think we should take, preferences and determination and beliefs of the Ukrainian political actors and society very seriously, right? So I think it's unfortunate that this appeasement strategy still has quite a few supporters in the West. I think it does nothing but other than to embolden Putin to reward aggression, to encourage nuclear proliferation as well, and it does not advance stable peace. So again, if you think about sort of very clear-eyed, like why are these calls for appeasement, right? Putin violated every principle of international law. This is not some sort of two-sided conflict. It is unprovoked war of aggression, right? So why would you advocate giving Putin something? And unless you're really pro-Putin, the only reason is because you fear nuclear escalation, right? So this is essentially giving in to Putin's nuclear blackmail. But again, I don't think that that would even is a good strategy to avoid nuclear escalation and nuclear proliferation and nuclear confrontation, because again, it only encourages, it basically sends a message that anybody with a nuclear weapon can get what they want on international arena. So if you think about, in other than immediate short-term goals, if you think Putin will nuke tomorrow and you talk with him now and that postpones it for some short period of time, right, in the medium to long term, you're actually increasing the danger, I think at least, of both nuclear war and nuclear proliferation, right? So what are the possibilities? So let me wrap up the possibilities of some things that we may see in the coming weeks and months. I think we are likely to see continued setbacks on the battlefield for Putin. Again, military experts will talk about details of this, but it seems like it's unlikely that Putin can turn the tide of war conventionally on the battlefield anytime soon, if at all. Basically, Ukraine will continue to fight. So I think we will see this continuation of military hostilities for some time to come. I think another important thing to look forward to and think about, and again, our panel experts on Russia will talk about it, what is likely and not likely to happen within Russia. I think this assumption that Putin can hold on to power forever and sort of whatever we contemplate doing or not doing, we have to assume that that's a constant. I personally think that that's really a question mark rather than a constant. It is certainly possible that Putin will hold on for a long time, but I think we know precious little about exactly how that regime works on the inside, sources of stability or instability of the regime. And I'm kind of reminded of the Soviet situation when USSR fell apart. Nobody predicted it, but once it did, everybody had an explanation. And it may be, again, I'm not saying that it will be, but I think we may see some sort of things were forever until there were no more, right? So I will end it at that. And thank you again for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Oksana. Okay, next we have Michael Kaufman, who is Research Program Director in the Russian Studies Program at CNA, which is Center for Naval Analysis. And he's also a fellow at the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Mike?
Okay, thanks for that kind introduction. I guess I'll follow up with some points focused on the military situation. So I think that since late August, it's pretty clear that Ukraine has had the initiative and has had a lot of the momentum in operations. It's been able to dictate matters on the battlefield. Ukraine on the whole has been able to put together its advantage in manpower and much stronger morale together with Western military assistance, which after some months has yielded considerably greater combat power. And so Ukraine has, since the very beginning of the war, has had a numerical advantage in terms of manpower, but a big disadvantage in equipment and also in artillery and firepower. And that disadvantage has been dramatically reduced over the past couple of months. So the Ukrainian military, probably over the past month, has demonstrated the ability to conduct concurrent offensives on two different fronts. And they've taken good advantage of the fact that they're able to ship forces and supplies along interior lines, meaning it's just a lot easier for Ukraine to transfer forces within Ukraine than it is for Russia to transfer forces in and around the battlefield. In fact, in many cases, Russia has to move forces from the southern part of Ukraine through Crimea, out across, Rostov, and all the way back to Ukraine's east if it wants to do a transfer along between these theaters. Now, Russian forces have been for some time stretched really thinly across a pretty broad front. In a lot of areas, the Russian military is woefully undermanned and exhausted. I think the biggest issue is that Moscow throughout this war has been unable to resolve the long-standing mismatch between the political goals that the leadership has had, many of which I would argue are not attainable, and the military means. And in trying to defend this territory, they've essentially been unable to reconcile this mismatch. And in essence, you see a military that over time has been attrition and just grows thinner and thinner. It's not able to hold this train. I think the Russian military has been suffering from a structural deficit of manpower. They've had a lot of issues with retention of personnel because you had plenty of people that would refuse to deploy or redeploy. Big problems with rotation. Most of the Russian military had been deployed in the war. They took heavy casualties. They didn't have additional forces to enable rotation to the conflict, which meant the military got exhausted over time and morale dropped and got lower and lower. And big issues with recruitment. They could only hire up volunteers who were interested in fighting for the money. These issues were all being discussed since early spring, and I think pretty well known in the military and local communities. So a lot of this was more a conversation of when would these structural problems and force availability eventually yield major problems for the Russian military on the battlefield. And attrition steadily ate away at the Russian forces as they kept pursuing offensives in the Donbass over the course of the spring and summer, which were quite costly, didn't yield much in the way of territory, and didn't look like they were really going to get Russia towards its political aims either way. Okay, so I think at this moment, Russian forces are in retreat and struggling to stabilize their lines in Luhansk. This is after the major defeat at Kharkiv and also the lesser, but nonetheless significant defeat at Liman. Russian forces have in the past week been forced to retreat in the northern part of Kherson, the foothold that they occupy west of the Dnieper River. Fighting there is actually somewhat different. I think it's much more costly and much more bloody because there's a much higher density of Russian forces there, and it's what's left of at least the better part of Russian troops. But the Russian position there for a long time has been very precarious. And if Ukrainian military is able to successfully advance, it can eventually make the situation rather untenable for the Russian military, just because they have very strained lines of resupply across the river and few options for retreat. So I think the Ukrainian strategy thus far has been to maximize what they can gain ahead of the winter. Winter doesn't necessarily stop operations; it just makes for a less dynamic battlefield, and then the war may become a bit more attritional until the ground becomes more favorable. And then I think, of course, a question of to what extent Ukraine can capitalize on that advantage to potentially renew offensive operations. But I think a big part of the Ukrainian approach has been to achieve objectives while preserving the force. And they've already demonstrated that they can retake territory, that they're effectively winning the war. And I think that's been a big political success. But a part of the operational sort of scheme, I think, has been to try to minimize losses in order to preserve as much of the force as possible through the winter. Okay, that said, I think you have to be cautious with straight line analysis because folks, I think, overly interpret Ukraine winning for sort of assuming that the war has already been won. I think a lot of people in the Ukrainian military are far more sober-minded about this question. I understand it's optimistic to think of this as a shorter war, but it could be a longer and protracted war also, which means you have to ask a lot of questions about securing sustainability of ammunition and equipment and further support from the West. We'll speak briefly about implementation of wartime measures, mobilization. So as of recent weeks, Russian political leadership has decided to implement wartime measures. These are not going to fix morale, but they are going to an extent, address the extensive retention issues they've had. In practice, the partial mobilization appears to be a general phase mobilization. I think that could very much extend the war. It's not going to address the quality of Russian forces, and it's not going to improve the Russian military's ability to use them on the battlefield, but will address the quantity, right? And so the way I tend to think about it is the quantity is not deterministic, but it does matter too. You shouldn't be overly dismissive of it. I think the Russian military is probably going to try to throw men at the line, particularly in Luhansk, to stabilize it early on. So far, it looks like those mobilized are going to get anywhere between no training to up to a month of training, and probably something's more in the middle, towards 2 weeks or less. It seems very varied between the regions. That is, in some regions, they have equipment and provisions. In other regions, soldiers have to mobilize personnel, have to buy their own. The level of training is going to vary extensively too. It'll be a very variegated process, and it looks incredibly messy in how it's being implemented. So this would have been much more effective, I think, for the Russian armed force, or at least a much more dangerous development in the war, had they enacted it in April, when the Russian military's initial campaign to conduct regime change was effectively defeated by end of March. Back then, they still had a lot more officers, enlisted professionals, more of the active force left over, and mobilization might have put that military in a different position come fall. Okay, and as I've sort of often commented that fortunately Putin's a master procrastinator rather than a particularly good strategist, and has consistently shown that when things go wrong, he often waits around to make hard or politically difficult decisions until all the options go from bad to worse. And that's kind of what's happened here in terms of when he's chosen to implement mobilization. And on top of that, there's an enduring challenge in that the Russian military is still limited by its overall capacity to employ these forces. That is, no matter how many personnel they may mobilize, they can only sustain and effectively command some limited number of troops on the battlefield. So on the whole, the way I look at it is that this may extend the war, but not necessarily change the trajectory of outcome. That said, some big notes of caution, as always. So first, mobilization in general introduces uncertainty, and it's very much understudied in our field. And you have to be very careful not to be either deterministic or dismissive on the subject. I think it also has political risks for the system, because deploying mobilized personnel headed into the winter could have real negative downstream effects, rather than mobilizing personnel in the spring ahead of an offensive, let's say in the spring or summer. If they're not well provisioned, if they're not well equipped, morale across that army could drop and have, I think, political consequences for the system. But I won't delve too much on that topic. I think prior to mobilization, that they had a choice fundamentally between retrenchment, mobilization, and escalation. They chose mobilization. These options were not mutually exclusive. So retrenchment, still an option, that is, they could withdraw or down from territory. The other two options to some extent remain. But the big challenge for the system is that in going through with mobilization and annexation, they've to a substantial extent, from my point of view, committed the regime to war and severed much of their ability to revise minimal war aims. So it's going to be a lot harder to adjust any of this. A couple of final points here. I think that the overall risk of nuclear escalation is fairly low, but still probably the highest it's been since 1983. I think that in the interim, while they're trying to see if mobilization can salvage the Russian military effort, that the risk will stay low, but that long term, it's likely going to grow, because mobilization has substantially risen, or at least increased the political stakes for the regime. Still, I think that the likelihood of Russia potentially losing this war without resorting to nuclear weapons is quite higher than the likelihood of Russian political leadership resorting to nuclear use. That's just one analyst's opinion. And I think that as the events of the last day have shown, Russian military still has conventional escalation options that they're likely to reach for between where we are now and any deliberation on nuclear use. Okay. All right, so that I'd like to close out at this point. Maybe turn it back to you, Elise. I don't know if I stuck within my time, and
Yes,
perhaps save the rest for Q&A.
Yes, you did. Thank you, Michael. Okay, our next speaker is Dimitri Gordenberg. He is Senior Research Scientist in the Russian Studies program at CNA, and he's also Associate at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Dima?
Thanks, Elise. And I'm going to try to kind of, Mike, I think, gave a great picture of the larger side of the overall war effort. I'm going to try to fill in a little bit of the specifics on what's going on right now, and then maybe talk a little bit about the future. So first of all, just the events of the last few days with the Ukrainian attack on the Kirch bridge and the Russian response today or last night. So first of all, the symbolism of attacking the Kerch bridge is obvious, and I don't think we need to spend too much time on that. But it's the link between Crimea and Russia, and by attacking it, that shows that Crimea is vulnerable in a very real way to Ukrainian attack. But more significantly, I think we should talk a little bit about some of the consequences for the military effort. Although the bridge is not completely out of commission, the damage that has been done complicates Russian logistics for supplying the South in the short term, at least, until it's repaired. as far as from what I understand, only one lane of traffic is open out of 4. So there's also the security checks that have now been implemented. That means traffic jams. And if there's traffic jams, that makes the road less useful for transporting supplies. So that seems fairly straightforward. There's also the rail link, but half the rail capacity is apparently knocked out. Only one of the tracks is useful, so that also reduces capacity. So so those are kind of factors. I think that, you know, from the Ukrainian side, other than the symbolism, that was the goal, is to try to reduce the ability of Russia to resupply its forces in the south. And it has not completely succeeded, but it has partially succeeded. Russia's response today is, I think, more likely a retribution attack rather than a sign of a new escalation. First of all, what we've seen is the Ukrainian air defense reduces the effectiveness of these long-range strikes. About half or so of the missiles were shot down from initial estimates, at least initial reports. Also, Russia has limited capacity to sustain this level of attack for long in terms of just numbers of precision-guided missiles that they have. So, and finally, Russian leaders have been talking in these terms, in terms of retribution and revenge, rather than we're going to keep doing this. For now, you know, some of the more right-wing mill bloggers have been talking about how we kind of keep doing this, but that's not who sets policy. Although, as long as the war continues, I expect that there will be occasional long-range strikes on major cities away from the front line, as a way for the Russian leadership to highlight the insecurity of all Ukrainians, and thus to kind of try to undermine support for continuing the war, kind of reduce morale and that sort of thing. So I think that we'll keep seeing this, but not at this level and not frequently. Let me turn now a little bit to the future of the ground effort and the overall state of the war. I think that we're likely to see one more big push from the Ukrainian side before the weather conditions worsen in the next month or so. This could be in Kherson, it could be in northern Luhansk, kind of continuing from the Kharkiv offensive. It could be both, right? They've shown they can do both at the same time quite recently. So it's possible that they would start a new direction of attack in Zaporizhzhia, for example, but I think it's less likely. It's easier to try to break through in areas where Russian forces are less dug in because they've retreated recently than in areas where lines have been stable for months. So I suspect they'll keep going where they've had success. Now, you know, Mike mentioned a little bit about the winter. I want to just expand on that a little bit. You know, weather, as he said, you know, weather causes a kind of a temporary pause in maneuver warfare, or likely to be more attritional. But we should remember that the key here is the ground, right? So the ground, when it's, you know, when there's a lot of rain, the conditions are not good, but that lasts 1 or 2 months, and then the ground freezes. And so at that point, we might see maneuver warfare become possible again. Certainly, if you go back to last winter, there was a lot of talk about, will Russia, how long can Russia fight until, you know, mud, right? So that was the winter. So we might see something of the same. And if it seems like Russian forces are having supply problems and the troops don't have adequate cold weather gear, if Ukrainians feel that they're more comfortable fighting in the cold rather than compared to the Russian forces, they could try to take advantage of that. On mobilization, again, I'll just expand a little bit on, since Mike covered it a fair bit. It's not likely to be a game changer, but it could, you know, because of the manpower shortage that Russia had, if they fill that, it could help to slow some of the Ukrainian advances, in some cases maybe even stop them, because throwing in relatively untrained people may still help in shoring up lines where just gaps in lines need to be filled with bodies, so to speak. It's probably less effective for prosecuting new advances where you probably want more skilled fighters. And there's also, but it could, I agree with Mike, it can have some effect. Of course, there's still the question of morale due to how well supplied are these new soldiers? How well trained are they? That'll certainly affect fighting ability, but I agree with Mike that we shouldn't really discount that. I want to say just a couple of words on just the last couple of days. We've heard that the Russian leadership has finally appointed a general to run the entire war effort, so to speak, Surovikin. Now, he's a pretty well-known general. He led the effort in Syria at one point. He has a long past history, including being responsible for killing protesters in 1991 during the August coup. Now, having one person in charge will undoubtedly help the command structure, but there's still that question of whether Putin will let him run the show or will he interfere. Now, Surovikin was already in charge in the south, and this didn't prevent the Kherson reversal, so he's not invulnerable by any means. And supposedly, the military command, which presumably is him, asked to withdraw from Kherson, but was denied permission by Putin. So if we see that kind of political interference, that could undermine his ability to run things. Now, he has a reputation for ruthlessness, so we might see more strikes on civilian targets, again, to undermine Ukrainian resolve. But again, that runs into the question of how much they have in terms of supplies of precision-guided munitions. Just wrap up on a couple of points also on the nuclear threat. I kind of agree with Mike on this. The main goal is to scare the West into curtailing support for Ukraine. And I would say further that the endless discussions of Russian nuclear threats in the Western media that we've seen in recent weeks contributes to this effort on the Russian side by raising people's fears, right? And therefore, I mean, Russia's goal is to undermine the Western support for Ukraine. And if people are scared of nuclear war, that can do that. So, of course, the governments need to do contingency planning for what might happen in this case, but because that's their job. But I would suggest that analysts and the media don't need to fan those flames because it's a fairly unlikely situation. And therefore, having lots of articles about what kind of nuclear weapons does Russia have and how can it use it, it's not necessarily helpful, and it just provokes anxiety without actually contributing to anything about the overall dynamic. A couple of closing notes on political factors. We've seen already today more expressions of discontent by India and China. They're becoming increasingly unhappy about the war. I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not anywhere near the point of signing on to sanctions, of course, but their statements are becoming increasingly pointed. And I think the West should try, to the extent that it can, to exploit this tension to further isolate Russia politically and maybe economically, hopefully economically, to the extent that that's possible. And finally, just a closing note on the long-term future. I think that Russia can't win as long as the West continues to provide material support to Ukraine. That's a key point. But Russia also can't admit defeat as long as Putin is in charge, just because he's backed himself into a corner in all the ways that have already been discussed. So a lot of discussion about in the West, among Western commentators, that sort of, well, we don't know what might come after Putin. This could be bad. I think that's somewhat misguided. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty about what comes after Putin, but we know for sure. One thing we know for sure is that Putin is bad, right? Like, there is nuclear blackmail, there is escalation, there's backing himself into a corner, there's all that. So, to my mind, the uncertainty may be a better option. The most likely scenario, if Putin goes, is internal jockeying for position in a new order, and that is likely to distract Russia to some extent from the external fight. And we've seen that in past Soviet and Russian history, where initially, after a regime change, after a long-serving leader, there's some distraction and there's some sort of settling the scores, and therefore withdrawal from confrontation in the wider world. So I think I'll just end with that. I think we shouldn't be scared of what comes after Putin, or at least no less scared than of what Putin is now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dima. Our next speaker is Anastasia Vlasenko, who is a postdoctoral fellow at New York University's Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, and she is an expert on Ukrainian and Russian politics. Anastasia?
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this seminar. So today I would like to discuss opinions on counteroffensive shared by the representatives of the lower ranks of the Ukrainian army and civilians. In addition, I would like to discuss responses to annexation of Ukrainian territories and mobilization in Russia published in Ukrainian mass media and shared on social media. The ongoing counteroffensive was a long expected move in the Ukrainian society. If we put war tactics aside, we can also interpret counteroffensive as a policy sponsored by the democratically elected Ukrainian government in response to multiple societal demands and expectations. This sentiment was widely spread and shared in the Ukrainian army. Currently, the Ukrainian armed forces and those who are affiliated with them are the most influential part of the Ukrainian mass public, which cannot be disregarded by the authorities. So keeping the morale high requires meeting soldiers' needs. While the volunteer movement is doing a great job supplying the army with basic necessities and the foreign military aid provides necessary weapons, there is a growing demand for quite specific strategic moves from the Ukrainian government. In August, one of such moves expected by many in the lower ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands here, was counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. Since these are the people who bear the highest cost of the counteroffensive and their most preferred direction was the one that could be occupied at the lowest cost possible. Well, at least, it was widely shared belief. So when on the 29th of August, Zelensky announced the start of a full-scale counteroffensive to take Russian occupied territory in the south, very few people in the Ukrainian army believed that Russians would actually buy it and would direct large numbers of troops and equipment to the Kharkiv region, from the Kharkiv region to the Kherson region. So as we know, this is exactly what happened. They relocated their troops from north to the south, and that made the months of September the months of extraordinary breakthrough in Kharkiv region. Well, the logical response to a successful counteroffensive was, as you all know, annexation of 4 additional Ukrainian regions, pseudo-annexation, and the algorithm which included referendums and then mass celebrations in Moscow resemble very much the events of 2014. This is why the reporting in the Ukrainian mass media and discussions on social media focused much more on counteroffensive than on annexation. This was not shocking news to anyone. One of the most widespread messages shared online in Ukraine was a picture with before and after map of Ukraine, meaning before annexation and after annexation. And this map looked exactly the same. And both maps included Crimea. A much more widely discussed topic in the Ukrainian society is partial mobilization in Russia. So back in 1990s, when Ukrainian citizens debated closer ties with Russia, like the one that currently exists between Russia and Belarus, one of the multiple arguments against it was that Russia would be able to mobilize Ukrainian men to fight in its wars. And back then, people referred to Chechnya or sometimes even to Afghanistan. So partial mobilization is viewed by many as an anticipated and even to a certain degree delayed move. Most mass media reports circulating in Ukraine do not view this mobilization as a threat to Ukrainian counteroffensive, since, as it was already mentioned, Russian conscripts are believed to be poorly trained and poorly motivated. And massive missile strikes of major Ukrainian cities, including the capital city of Kyiv, today provide support for this argument. It is widely argued that these massive strikes are a response to the explosion on the Crimean Bridge. However, according to some reports, Ukrainian military intelligence is currently sharing this information. The Russian troops received instructions from the Kremlin to prepare massive missile strikes on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure on October 2nd and on October 3rd. What it means that it happened before the explosion on the Crimea bridge, and therefore it was a response to the counteroffensive itself. Targeting of power plants, which also happened today, also made it impossible for Ukrainians to keep exporting electricity to the EU. So starting from October 11, from tomorrow, there will be no Ukrainian electricity in the EU countries. And that means that some European countries will have to reconsider whether they want to return to importing energy resources from Russia. So in a way, this is also a move that that is supposed to support Russian energy sector. So as we can see, the only response to the Ukrainian successful counteroffensive, which is available to the Russian armed forces, is bombing of civilian and energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And this is why partial mobilization in Russia is not considered to be an actual threat. Another topic discussed by Ukrainian mass and social media is mobilization of Ukrainian men by the Russian military in newly annexed regions. The goal here is to identify these men and to arrange conditions for them to surrender so that they could be safely evacuated to the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government. Unfortunately, under current conditions at the front lines, it is really difficult to implement, even though there is anecdotal evidence which shows that this safe route of surrendering is actually available to Russians. So it should be available to Ukrainians in the recently annexed territories as well. Finally, mobilization in Russia engendered discussions of whether Ukraine should start mobilizing as well. So far, Ukraine had no problem mobilizing people for the war effort, instead struggling with limited resources to arm them and to train them. While experts argue that this is a good problem to have, since with the foreign aid, both problems can be solved. However, the increase in the number of Russian troops on the Ukrainian territory raises the questions about the potential new wave of mobilization in Ukraine. And Zelensky's administration mentioned on multiple occasions that mobilization in Ukraine is not planned, but the final decision will be made by the Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, Valery Zaluzhny. As you probably know, Zaluzhny is one of the most popular public figures in Ukraine right now, so his decisions are unlikely to be met with disapproval from the general public. In the last 12 hours, Ukrainians faced very similar challenges to those of February 24. This is another message shared on social media today that I feel like it is February 24 again. In social media, we see multiple messages that it is the same, but the difference is that Ukrainians are not afraid anymore. We see also multiple videos of Ukrainians sitting in bomb shelters, and we also hear, as it was already mentioned here, reports on successful fundraising for the war effort, as shared by Prytula Foundation and many others. So in a nutshell, Ukrainians' morale remains high both in the army and among the civilians, and Ukrainian government and higher ranks of the Ukrainian army enjoy high level of popularity among the general public, meaning that battlefield decision-making can be quick and not met with any sort of backlash from the general population. Civil society is actively engaged in the war effort as well, and this unity and the absence of salient current political divisions in the Ukrainian society has definitely contributed to the success of the counteroffensive, and I hope will keep contributing in the future. This is all I wanted to mention with regards to today's seminar topic, and I'm looking forward to questions and further discussion.
Thank you, Anastasia. Okay, and now we will turn to Sam Green, who is Director for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and he is Professor in Russian Politics at King's College London. Sam?
Thank you, Elise, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this panel. I've already learned a tremendous amount and hope to continue learning, so I'll try to keep this pretty brief. I mean, look, for those of us who study Russian domestic politics, obviously this whole series of events over the last 8 months or so, and in fact, events leading up to that, have been demobilizing, to use an overused word, in a lot of ways, right? I'm certainly, among those who were on record before the war thinking that this war was not likely to happen, mostly because and I don't think I'm alone in this, had a model of decision-making in Russian politics that was centered around an assumption that the regime is interested in its own survival. That saw very clear costs and risks associated with this war, that could not identify the benefits for regime survival that would come with this war, and thus that thought that the war simply wasn't predicted by the model, so to speak. Right? Obviously, that was wrong. Right? And one of the lessons that you learn from that, first of all, is not to make predictions in the Washington Post, but second of all, is that we have to allow for a greater degree of uncertainty in the analysis that we make. Right. So I, for example, did not think still, right, that mobilization of the kind that we've seen in recent weeks in Russia would make much sense from a Russian, at least political perspective, and from a regime survival perspective, for reasons I'll get to in a moment, which have already been hinted at by others. But I had to at least allow for the possibility that could happen. That puts us on a very difficult sort of slippery slope as analysts, in that we're all getting to the point where we're increasingly good at sort of believing 6 impossible things before breakfast, right? Once you factor the nonsensical into the picture, things that you previously would have ruled out as unlikely or impossible become not only possible, they become plausible, and they in some cases begin to look even inevitable, right? So it wasn't hard to understand, even if it didn't make a lot of sense from a kind of a rational choice perspective, why mobilization would be a decision that the regime would take, and that puts us in the unfortunate position of having to sort of allow for anything, right, up to and including the use of nuclear weapons, with all the caveats that have already been mentioned. But I think that in allowing for that uncertainty, we also have to understand that we're not the only people who are uncertain. And it's useful to remember that Putin himself at the top of this system operates with a high degree of uncertainty. So what Michael earlier described as his masterful procrastination, to me, is a reflection of an approach to policymaking that remains risk averse, but that fundamentally avoids committing the regime to a course of action, particularly a potentially irreversible course of action, right? When the consequences are not easily predictable from the regime's own perspective, right? So when they do embark on something like mobilization, they don't know what the military response to it's going to be. They don't know what impact it's going to have on the battlefield. They don't know whether the military is going to be able to absorb it, again, for reasons that Michael and Dima have already talked about. They don't know what the public response is going to be. They don't know what the global response is going to be. And so we get exactly what Michael described, I think accurately, as something that looks like a phased general mobilization rather than a one-off, which doesn't necessarily mean that it won't turn into a one-off, right? And this pattern of experimentation and reevaluation is something that we've seen from Putin really consistently throughout his time in power, and something that I think we're likely to continue to see, right? Now, turning to mobilization itself, right, a lot of people obviously are wondering when this is going to provoke some kind of resistance, and the reality is that it is provoking resistance. Right? Might not be the resistance that we would like to see, but the resistance is there. We're seeing it in terms of the numbers of people who fled the country. We're seeing it in terms of small-scale protests in some places, a couple of larger protests in the early days. But mostly what we're seeing is individualized resistance, right? People solving the problem that the military call-up creates for them by getting themselves out of the way through individualized strategies, whether, again, that's heading for the border or seeking various exemptions from the draft, right? We've seen small groups mobilize, whether these are small towns in places like Dagestan or Buryatia, but we've also seen corporations, whole sort of sectors of the economy seek carve-outs for themselves from this from this mobilization. I think it's important to remember within this that collective resistance, right, isn't a response to an opportunity, right, to resist. It's a response to the incentives that the state creates, right? Particularly whether or not the state treats the issue and the people who are afflicted by the issue in a consistent and a coherent manner, right? So if Putin decides that what he does need at the end of the day is in fact not just 300,000, but 1.2 million or whatever the number is, or may end up being that he needs to mobilize. If he does decide that in fact this needs to be handled in a more administratively and bureaucratically consistent way, right? Then he ends up in a position where he has to clamp down on exemptions. He has to close down a lot of the routes that people are using for individualized escape from the mobilization. And he begins to create the incentives that can lead to a more politicized and a collectivized response of the kind that we do see periodically in Russia over the years. One important thing to remember, I think, is that both individualized and collective responses to something like mobilization, right, can be sufficient to force the regime to backtrack, not necessarily to force a regime change or a revolutionary outcome, but I don't think that's the question at the moment. The question is this enough to prevent Putin from pressing ahead with further mobilization? What we've seen so far reminds me a lot of the ways in which Russians responded to the COVID restrictions that were put in place in 2020 in cities across the country, and which were really sufficient, even though they were individualized, right, to force the Kremlin and local and regional governments across the country, right, to backtrack on that almost completely. Right? And what we're seeing in terms of the Kremlin's response to that now is again very similar to the way that the Kremlin responded then. In other words, it's giving people targets, right? Governors, as then, were responsible for their pandemic responses on an individual basis, on a local basis. That seems to be what we're seeing at various levels of the system when it comes to getting this mobilization. As long as targets are hit, the Kremlin doesn't really care how well you're doing that, what sorts of problems you might be creating. You're on your own to figure out what the best option is and what the most effective way forward is, right? As long as we see that, I think the likelihood is that we continue to see these individualized responses from the population to mobilization. Whether that turns into something bigger really depends, I think, on, again, what the state does. Finally, looking at the bigger picture, I remain convinced that Putin, at the end of the day, is interested in regime security, not national security. And I think that's reflected in a couple of things. And I think it forces us to think a little bit more clearly about how we talk about and analyze this war and where it may be going. Right? Putin, I think, retains the ability to declare victory with significant rhetorical flexibility. Right? I take Oksana's point at the outset that everything he's said, right, consistently from the beginning of the war up until even just this morning, right, has maintained references to these maximalist goals, right, and I would continue to hear him, expect to hear him talk about that, and I would expect that if he can attain those goals, he will very happily take them. Right, but equally consistent has been the amount of flexibility he's given himself in just about all of his public statements, and just about all the statements that we've seen coming out of the Kremlin and the regime. More broadly, right? And that is so consistent that it's very difficult for me to believe that that's not purposeful. Right? I do think, again, as Michael and Dima have pointed to earlier, that flexibility has narrowed a little bit, right? Since particularly the announcement of the quote unquote annexation of additional territory. But the reality is that even there, I think that they will be able to find a way to present themselves as an aggrieved irredentist state with claims against Ukraine if that's the way that Putin decides his regime security is best served. Right? What that means is that what happens on the battlefield, right, is not directly determinative of how Putin decides he's going to fight this war. It's one of a number of factors that's going to fit into a very subjective calculation about how he's going to be able to play this at home, about the resources he's going to have to spend in terms of domestic politics, both with the masses and the elites. And we have very little, and we're going to continue to have very little legibility of how that subjective calculation is made, right? It also means that I think what happens on the battlefield is going to have a lot less of an impact on his calculations than it does on ours, right? We've gotten into a habit of allowing our strategic discourse about the war, the policy discourse, but also the public discourse, to be reshaped every time the tides of war shift a little bit or significantly, right? We've seen this obviously with the shift from a conversation about a war of attrition, right, to all of a sudden a conversation about a war that might actually be able to be won by Ukraine just over the last month or so, right? We are likely to see that a shift again. The problem with that is not simply that it makes it more difficult for us to settle on strategic goals, right? But it allows Putin to believe that he can shape our strategic goals and shape Western and, to a lesser extent, Ukrainian willingness to fight, right? By changing the conduct of the war, right, as he's done today, in order to leverage our own behavior, right? So there is not just kind of I think a philosophical and a moral imperative to take a bit of a longer view of this war, right? But one that's actually dictated by an understanding of how Putin may be trying to use, or is likely to be trying to use, our views of the war as he decides how to fight. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sam. And our final speaker today is Timothy Fry, who is the Marshall D. Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia. And he is also the author of the book with the prescient title, Weak Strong Man, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. Tim?
Thanks a lot. It's been a great roundtable, and I hope I can hold up my end of the bargain and not drag down the mean after these really terrific comments. I just have a couple points I want to make. One is that, the framework that we have for studying autocracies, I think, still applies to trying to understand Putin's behavior during the conflict, just as it did before. Certainly, Putin is not the first leader to engage in war optimism, to be overly confident. Lots of people thought that the Russian military would do much better than it did. So my sense was, prior to the war, that it would be very difficult to find an agreement that would make Moscow, Kyiv, and Washington happy. At the same time, I also shared Sam's view that this was really out of keeping with Putin's past behavior. So I was kind of on the fence. I would say a couple points is that Putin has made his job so much more difficult with this invasion. We talk about autocrats facing these dual threats of being overthrown by an elite coup or being overthrown by the masses. And the difficult problem is that these two threats are often difficult to resolve at the same time. Solving one typically exacerbates the other. But what has happened since the invasion is that Putin had basically an elite that was fairly consolidated around a particular political system, masses that were also fairly consolidated around a set of political rules. And now we see great fragmentation, not only among the elite, but also among the masses. The war was fought without any kind of preparation of either mass or elite opinion to rally the cause. Most observers were caught off guard. And what we see now is much more infighting among the elite, particularly as the war has not gone as predicted, and also among the mass public as well. I keep turning as a very imperfect, but in some ways I think a helpful analogy to the U.S. experience in the Vietnam War, where prior to the Vietnam War, most Americans thought the U.S. was a force for good in the world. Almost by definition, we might have done some bad things, but on balance, we were a force for good. And I think many Russians felt the same way. If you look at public opinion polling, Russia's victory over World War II is, the touchstone of Russia's place in the world. But just as Vietnam forced a very difficult conversation about US's role in the world, I think the same thing is going on mainly around kitchen tables now, but increasingly in print and on Telegram as well, about Russia's place in the world. We see similarities in that, the draft pours gasoline on opposition to the war as well. We see that people generally don't pay attention until, a big event like the Kirch, the mobilization or the Tet Offensive. So I think there are some parallels here, and I don't think this bodes well for Russia. Vietnam did not end so well for the United States, and it rent our politics for generations afterwards. And one could imagine a similar scenario in Russia as well. So what can Putin do? Well, there's been a lot of talk about elite reshuffles, given the poor performance of the Russian military on the ground, the FSB in preparing the Kremlin and providing information about what to expect in Ukraine, also a great failure. And there have been increasingly calls for Shoigu to resign, for Putin to fire this person or that person. But that would be very much not in keeping with Putin's strategy. The political system relies heavily on loyalty rather than some kind of institutionalized rules. And Putin has been very reluctant to fire anyone within the inner or the outer inner circle. And when he does dismiss somebody, he usually gives them a soft place to land. For example, Dimitri Medvedev was kind of shunted aside as prime minister, lands a place in the Security Council and has become an increasingly prominent hawk on the war. Even Alexei Kudrin is not banished to Siberia, but is the head of the audit chamber. And it would be, so I think that makes it difficult for Putin, that if he were to try to really make a big reshuffle of the some member of his inner circle, that would be a real sign that the game had really changed among the elites. And this may be one of the reasons why Putin has not done so yet to date. So I think his ability to resolve the problem by elite shuffles, which is something that we often see in autocracies, is a card that's more difficult for Putin to play than for other types of autocrats. Also, it would further damage Putin's greatest achievement, which was the notion that he had brought some stability within Russia, and that he could be the arbiter among elites who have, often very much conflicting interests. If he's unable to do that, he becomes much more vulnerable, and not necessarily in the sense that he would be overthrown. We know it's difficult to overthrow autocrats. The risks of trying to overthrow the autocrat and losing are very high, and it's difficult for elites to coordinate. But it does mean that Putin's ability to get things done, I think, is going to be much more compromised. It will be much more difficult for him to use persuasion and bribery and many of the other kind of softer tactics that he uses to keep the elites in line than he has in the past. Another thing that Putin could do is to increase the mobilization. But I think, again, Putin's reluctance to call up a full mobilization is again in keeping with his long-standing pattern of asking as little as possible from the Russian people. I mean, the two times when we've seen Putin's popularity take a hit are when he asked some Russians to tighten their belt around pension reforms. So I think this is, very much in keeping with Putin's past practice. And there was some interesting polling from FOAM, which asked Russians about their level of anxiety, and it had been, kind of pretty constant until the mobilization happened, and then we saw a big spike in anxiety, which is really the first kind of, I think, large-scale reaction among the Russian public, just to recognize the seriousness the endeavor that they've gotten themselves into. So I think Putin has made it much more challenging to continue to govern Russia. And two of the tactics that he might have employed, kind of elite reshuffles or being able to rally the masses behind him, have shown to be much less effective, I think, than we might have thought. So let me just end it with that. I'm very much looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tim.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Go ahead, Josh. Thanks to all our speakers, and Josh is going to kick off the Q&A.
Yes, I wanted, and I was just going to say the same thing. I want to thank the speakers. It's been enormously educational, and I've learned a ton from listening to everybody here. There's a few things that we have about 20 minutes left to touch upon, and I want to think, there's a couple of different types of questions that have come in and a couple of different things that have come up. There's a whole host of questions that have come up around the military aspects of it. There's some questions in the Q&A about the nukes. There's questions about missiles, about troops. There's been some questions about foreign powers' involvement with Turkey and Belarus. I also think a second thing that's come up from this that has been enormously interesting to me is the claim that's been made that the war doesn't end with Putin still in power, but then nicely ending with everything Tim talked about all the sort of challenges that Putin faces to remaining in power. So that's something I think we can talk about as well. But I want to kick off with a question that came up in the Q&A just recently about something we haven't heard much about, but which strikes me as something that's kind of very different about this particular military conflict. And I would love some clarification from anyone who wants to answer this, which is this question of, and I think a couple times we heard them mention the military bloggers, the role of Telegram. It's very notable that after the Russian government moved to ban other social media platforms earlier on in the conflict, there has not been an attempt to ban Telegram. And we increasingly see this as part of reporting about what is being reported on in Telegram. And in particular by the kind of, the military bloggers, the pro-military bloggers. And Dima, you made a comment earlier on saying that these are not the policymakers. But I think I do want to throw out this question. What is the role of this? And we know from reporting in the US and reporting on Trump, for example, social media posts is really catnip for reporters because you can cut and paste it into your reporting. And so is this a bit of a distraction here? Or is this actually a sort of something we should really be paying attention to in the sense that it's kind of a new pressure that Putin has to deal with in this particular context? While somebody answers that question, I'll ask the others to sort of think about answers to the other bigger things, and then I'll direct them there. But I don't know if Tim or Sam, you guys want to take a first cut at this question about the Telegram bloggers from the Putin perspective, or Michael or Dima, if you want to take a cut at this from the actual military side of things. Do we think the military is paying attention to these bloggers?
Well, I don't know if, I think the politicians, the political leaders in Russia are paying attention. Doesn't mean that they're, they have, completed, inordinate influence, but they have some influence. And there's certainly pressure on leadership to, from that side. And we've heard, it's the thing about the mill blogger types is that they're harder to repress than kind of liberal opposition types, right? One thing I've heard say is that unlike the liberal opposition, they have different goals, so they're from Putin, so they're out. Whereas the mill bloggers, they have the same goals, they just disagree on tactics, and they want harder line, and so Putin has other considerations that aren't just about prosecuting the war effort, being a leader of a country, right? And so he has to deal with these other factors. So I think that it's an interest group, right? It's a pressure group, so they have to be taken into account. But we shouldn't overstate their influence either.
Yeah, I would just add that we know that autocracies are low information systems, and there really is a great hunger to try to figure out what people think. So to the extent that the mill bloggers and the people on Telegram can create an alternative narrative that is some source of information, however distorted, about what people are or what some people are thinking, I do think it is important because, we know from other autocracies that leaders are constantly looking for any source of information to try to figure out what's going on, in the absence of free media and all the other institutions that operate in other kinds of systems.
Let me go. Oh, Sam, did you want to?
Yeah, just I mean, briefly, I think I would agree with all of that, but I'd add an additional element, which is that, there are, if people just want to know what's going on in the war, right, and just be able to talk about it around the kitchen table, right, then for a lot of people, television is going to be enough. For some people for whom this is particularly important and who want to have a sense of involvement, then keeping track of the inside information you get from Telegram is great, right? But what Putin has done with the mobilization is actually give people a lot of reason to pay attention to these Telegram channels much more than they were before, because now all of a sudden the war is real, right? Now all of a sudden it's something you're much more likely to end up having to be involved in. So if you want information, right, about what you're going to have to do, what kind of your circumstances are going to be, right, and whether you should head for the border or for the point and come on, right, you're going to get that information on Telegram much more readily than you're going to get it from official propaganda. And Putin has to be very, very careful about how he manages that. On the one hand, he doesn't want that to turn into a resource for people who want to escape the trap, right? But if he does try to shut it down, and we have to remember they did try to shut down Telegram in the past, and it doesn't work very well. You end up actually creating more distrust, and you take this constituency, which actually is, as Tim was saying, actually pretty committed to the war and to the goals of it, right? And turning it into one that you lose all traction with. So it's a knife edge for him.
Mike, you wanted to jump in with a comment on that?
Yeah, just a brief comment that, what's going on Telegram can be a very valuable use of information. In fact, a lot of what you're seeing on Twitter and social media is just being pulled off of Telegram by open source accounts and aggregators. That's the fact of where it's coming from. People like me often read it firsthand on Telegram, then see it in other social media channels. There's a lot of useful things out there. The only thing I'd say is that please be very careful with us, consume it cautiously. There's also a lot of fakes, dated footage on there. And there's a very distinct slant and agenda from a lot of these military channels and commentators. There's almost been a sort of strange, surreal legitimation of commentators like Igor Girkin, also known as Strelkov, where now a lot of people are citing and reposting him as though this is a very legitimate and authoritative source all of a sudden, or at least in the way they're treating him, which I found somewhat puzzling. This is particularly puzzling for people who have been dealing with this conflict from the outset. And so in that regard, I say I think it does matter. I think a lot more people are following what's going on Telegram, as Sam and Dimitri and others have said here. But also for those who are listening and who are following this conflict, all I'd say is just be cautious. Over the last 7 months, I've seen a lot of DIY military analysis emerge based on people who think that they can watch these Telegram channels and these videos, and they too can do this. And what I'm going to say is you're welcome to it. Please do it with a lot of caution. This is a bit harder than it looks.
Josh, can I just make a very quick addition to this? I sort of thinking about Telegram, like one thing that parallel that comes to my mind is sort of broader question of Putin's treatment and engagement with the more ultra nationalists in Russia, right? Because they support some of his agenda, but they also could be a threat. And we have seen this after 2014 when, they were obviously all excited about Crimea, but then when things in Donbass didn't go quite as well and Putin didn't push as far as they wanted, right? Like they became a threat. And I think there were a series of measures to kind of silence these things. And I wonder if we may see something like this playing out again with these Telegram channels that have, 500,000 followers who are being very critical of the conduct of the war, right? And Putin can try to satisfy them, potentially purge somebody in the Ministry of Defense and so forth. But if it doesn't bring the results, right? In other words, the problems, as other speakers have been saying in the Russian army are quite systemic. And if these things cannot be fixed, right, to what extent these mill bloggers can become a challenge to Putin, right? Like, I don't know if they will be, but I think that's sort of, a context, I think, within which this Telegram channel situation can also be addressed.
Anastasia, in view of your earlier comments about Ukrainian public opinion, do you want to say anything about Telegram or other media platforms in Ukraine and maybe a little bit about how it interacts with what's going? I mean, it's kind of an interesting situation, right? That both Russians and Ukrainians are using this here. Is there interaction across the two here from what you're seeing on the subjects that you've been talking about with Ukrainian military?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that came up to my mind was that Ukrainian armed forces are actually using Telegram as the most effective channel to communicate that Russian conscripts can surrender. So there is a Telegram channel, quite popular one, which is called I Want to Live, Хочу жить. And this is sponsored by the Ukrainian government, and the main target audience are those newly mobilized in Russia. There isn't much content in that Telegram channel. It's mostly hotline telephone numbers at which Russian soldiers can call so that they can surrender safely and without being killed. But you can see how the presence of Telegram actually helps the Ukrainian government in a way to popularize, so to say, its policies. On the other hand, I agree that the availability of Telegram in Russia provides the Russian regime with valuable information it cannot acquire in other way. So let's again think about this Telegram channel, I Want to Live. The level of engagement on this Telegram channel kind of tells the Russian authorities how many people will actually surrender if they are sent to the front lines. And also it helps to identify specific individuals and not to send them there. So it goes both ways. And there are multiple channels like this where Ukrainians and Russians interact in a way. I also want to mention that there are Belarusian channels which recently switched, let's say, from Russian language to Belarus language as a way of communication. And we can see that there was a huge backlash from their Russian subscribers. So that all kind of sends messages to Russian population in a way that would be impossible through the TV channels.
Thanks, Anastasia. We have a lot of questions, specific military questions on this. We're down to 10 minutes. So I want to pose a couple of questions to Mike first, and then Dima, you can jump in on it. And then if you, and then I'm going to ask everybody, the rest of the other four panelists for a final comment. And the final comment is going to be on the question of, can we see a negotiated end to this war while Putin is still in power? That's what I want to just kind of, that was a sort of big thing that came out of this. So, and I think you're probably going to have about a minute each when you get to it. So, so your thoughts, I'm going to ask you your thoughts on that. But for Mike and Dima, if you guys can be brief and concise, we have a few questions that are present in the chat. And so I'd like to get to as many of these as possible. First, we have Kim Martin's question about whether there's a limit to the number of missiles that Russia really has at its availability if it's not concerned about precision strikes. And then there's a similar related question to that, asking about the extent to which today's, the strikes that have taken place in the last 24 hours, how targeted were they? Or was this just, we're just going to lob missiles up at a bunch of cities to make the point that we can lob missiles at cities? There's a secondary question about Belarus getting involved. There's another question about Belarus getting involved. And then finally, there've been a couple of comments about this question about why you are, I guess, maybe not more concerned or didn't devote more of the time of your talk to thinking about the fact that Russia might actually try to use a nuclear weapon in a strategic reason to accomplish battlefield goals, as opposed to just from these sort of political purposes that you've talked about right now. So maybe Mike and then Dima, you guys can limit yourself to 2 to 3 minutes on these, maybe and address different features of this, and then we'll go around to everyone else for wrap-ups.
All right. Well, maybe I'll go first then. Okay. To Kim Martin's question. So, is there a limit to the number of missiles? Yeah, of course. Countries typically run out fairly fast in a conventional war. They never have enough munitions, and conventional wars come down to attrition. They're very tasking on ammunition. So, you've seen over the course of this war, Russian rate of fire, that is the actual rate of strikes, really dwindle. And then over time, them increasingly using missiles that are not very suitable for the role in which they're trying to use them, or are quite older. All of which points to the fact that their stocks of precision-guided weapons are dwindling. All right, that being said, Russia does make some amount of missiles every month, and so they could probably sustain a rate of fire approximate to whatever it is they produce, but it's likely to be rather low. All right, I've seen a lot of bad estimates with sort of the false certainty of numbers assigning to what percentage of stocks they may have, how much they can produce, and what have you. And I'll just stay away from that because I don't think it's worth making guesstimates. How targeted are they? They do look rather targeted, but you have a couple cases in these strikes. The first are strikes against critical infrastructure that I think are part of more of a Russian campaign to exhaust Ukraine and to damage critical infrastructure, especially going into the winter. All right. Another set of strikes you will see are things that miss critical infrastructure because either Russian targeting is bad, the missiles are unreliable, or their guidance systems fail. And to some extent, you do see strikes in civilian areas. And this can be, I mean, we can surmise, at least my hypothesis, that some of these are designed to try to prevent the return of normalcy to life in Ukraine and prevent the return of investment. That is, to prevent this war from being localized the way the initial conflict in the Donbass was. That's just a hypothesis. So you see a range sort of what Russian missiles are aimed at. On why, I'm not sure how to answer your question. Why I didn't devote more time to the issue of what? Battlefield employment of nuclear weapons?
I mean, I think that was a little bit of the question there, yeah.
Okay, well, let me talk about battlefield employment of nuclear weapons.
Okay, like a minute.
Okay, sure. So most of the conversation is on Russian select nuclear employment for escalation management purposes, the kind that could have strategic effects in this conflict and political outcome. Things like nuclear tests, nuclear demonstration, very limited employment. When it comes to nuclear use for warfighting, this is a very difficult and thorny issue. Most of the people in the conversation, well, to be very frank, you have to know a tremendous amount about the effects of nuclear weapons and how they interact with military forces and how they can be used. The one thing I can say here is this will probably require substantial use of theater nuclear weapons. A lot of times people talk about tactical nuclear weapons, but that's not a very useful term. What you really mean is probably battlefield use of nuclear weapons. Most of the discussions on Russian nuclear escalation are not about nuclear warfighting or battlefield nuclear weapons. That said, last comment on the subject. In the last 2 weeks, I've learned a tremendous amount about nuclear weapons that I don't think is true by reading things on social media. So be very careful with the subject. Nuclear weapons are not just large conventional explosives or something like that. They have real distinct additional effects, and I wouldn't be overly dismissive of their potential impact. That being said, I also wouldn't be particularly overly fearful of it either, right? I fully agree with Dimitri that this conversation has taken off in the last couple of weeks and often in not especially helpful directions.
Thanks, Mike. Dima, is there anything you want to add on the military questions that Mike didn't get to?
Yeah, just on Belarus, since
Okay, thanks.
it wasn't addressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is referring to an announcement today that, or maybe it was yesterday, that Lukashenko, is about bringing Russian forces are coming back into Belarus. I think that this is a move that's primarily designed to make Ukrainian commanders think about what might happen, right? So to take some forces away from the front lines and in order to guard the northern borders, right? I think that's much more likely than a new attack on, let's say, Kiev. That didn't go well the first time, and they have fewer and weaker forces now. So I don't see why they would think it would go better the second time. So I think it's just a kind of an intimidation tactic and this diversion distraction. Let's put it that way.
Great, thanks so much. For the remaining panelists, we do have 4 minutes left now, so you guys can have a minute each. But like this question that's come up here about, is there a way that the fighting ends while Putin is still in power? Or is that really a line in the sand here? So maybe we'll go in the opposite order as we did before. And Tim, we'll have you go first.
Great, really hard question. It depends a lot on the context. So it's hard to give an answer in the abstract. I agree with Sam that Putin still has a fair amount of room to declare victory. We stood up to the West. We've done, we've shown the world that we're still a power. And one could write that speech. Just to go back to the Vietnam analogy, the U.S. knew it was going to lose in Vietnam many years before it decided to declare victory and go home, which is not a particularly optimistic precedent.
Sam?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think yes, Putin has the flexibility right now. The way the war feels like it's going, I really don't see frankly, a negotiating opportunity or a partner on the other side, right? But I think we have to expect that will shift, and we'll see. But I would not expect. I think we also have to differentiate between sort of negotiated ends of fighting or negotiated outcomes and solutions. I don't see a negotiated outcome and solution under Putin or whoever comes next, frankly.
Thanks, Sam. Anastasia and Oksana from the Ukrainian side. Anastasia?
It really depends whether Putin manages to maintain support within the Russian elites. If he does, he can go on with this war till he naturally dies of natural causes. But if he doesn't, then we can expect sooner than later end of this armed conflict.
Thank you. Oksana?
Yeah, I don't think a negotiated solution is likely for reasons I was, referring originally. I think whatever happens at the negotiations table would be determined by what happens on the battlefield. And in that sense, like if, say, somehow miraculously Putin was successful, right, turned the tide of war and, destroyed half of Ukraine, and maybe, Ukrainians would agree to then give in whatever Putin wants or most of what he wants. If you call that negotiation solution, I think that's unlikely. I think otherwise, we're likely to see the fighting. I don't actually think, maybe here I'm a little disagreeing with Tim and Sam, that Putin actually has that much flexibility. It's true, Russian propaganda is very powerful, but there is only so much you can sell as victory. I think if they, basically were able to hold on to the 4 regions and Ukrainians agree to this, sure, then you can try to say like, okay, we have liberated half of Novorossiya, and then, maybe plan for further attack. But as long as Ukrainians continue to retake territory, right, like Liman was annexed for all of 2 days, right? And so I think it's an important point that propaganda is very powerful, but I think there are limits to also what you can sell as victory to the society. So my short answer, I guess, would be no, I don't see, the negotiated solution with Putin in power.
Okay, thanks to everyone. I just want to say something on a personal note, having awakened this morning to check if my friend in Kiev and former actually teacher at Columbia of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian politics, to check whether she was still alive. I just want to kind of extend a kind of recognition that many Ukrainians are now indeed feeling what one of the panelists said, which is that we're sort of a return to February 24th, waiting for help from the West, kind of not knowing what comes next, whether this is an escalation or a new beginning. And so I want to thank all of our panelists for trying to bring an analytical frame to these very emotional, disturbing, and frightening issues. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming. It was a great panel.
Thank you.